The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of ochre and shadow beneath the unforgiving Syrian sun. Lieutenant Colonel Vera, Nightshade, Kovalenko pressed her back against the twisted metal of what had once been a Russian T-90 tank, its armor scarred and blackened by ordnance that had found its mark 3 days ago. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the wreckage of what intelligence had called a routine patrol. But nothing about this mission had been routine. She checked her watch, 13:47 hours. The extraction window was closing, and the radio had been dead for 2 hours. Somewhere in the haze of heat shimmer, she could hear the distinctive thump-thump-thump of rotor blades growing louder. Multiple aircraft, heavy lift capability. The cavalry was coming, but whose cavalry remained the question that made her grip her sidearm tighter. Vera's desert camouflage was torn at the shoulder, revealing the faded outline of a patch that had been hastily removed. The Ghost Battalion, a unit that officially didn't exist, conducting operations that never happened in places that weren't on any map. She'd been flying for them for 3 years, ever since the incident in Belarus that had made her radioactive to conventional command structures. Too skilled to discharge, too problematic to promote, too valuable to waste. The helicopter sounds were closer now. She could distinguish at least 3 distinct rotor signatures. A 60 Blackhawks, definitely American, but that didn't necessarily mean friendly. In this part of the world, aircraft changed hands like currency, and yesterday's ally could be today's executioner. Through the shimmer, she spotted the first aircraft cresting the ridge line, then another, and another. A full squadron flying in combat formation, their dark silhouettes cutting through the desert haze like predators circling wounded prey. They were moving fast, too fast for a routine extraction. This was a hunt. Vera's mind raced through the possibilities. Had the mission been compromised? Had someone leaked her position? Or worse, had the Ghost Battalion finally decided she knew too much? The patch on her shoulder had been removed for a reason, and that reason might be closing in at 150 knots. The lead helicopter broke formation, banking sharply toward her position. Through the dust and heat, she could see the crew chief in the doorway, scanning the wreckage field through high-powered optics, looking for something, or someone. Then they stopped. All 3 aircraft, as if connected by invisible strings, suddenly flared their rotors and came to a hover 300 meters out. Not the aggressive pattern of a tactical assault, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of recognition, of hesitation, of fear. The crew chief had spotted something that made hardened combat veterans pause in the middle of a mission. Something that changed everything. 12 hours earlier, Vera had been sitting in the briefing room of a forward operating base that didn't appear on any military maps, listening to Colonel Marcus, Ironside, Hendricks explain why she was about to fly into the heart of Syrian airspace alone. The room smelled of stale coffee and the particular brand of anxiety that came with missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "The target is a downed reconnaissance drone," Hendricks had said, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of classified satellite imagery. "Russian manufacture, but the payload is ours. We need it back before anyone else gets curious." Vera had studied the photographs, noting the terrain, the probable defensive positions, the escape routes. All standard reconnaissance work. But something in Hendricks' tone suggested this wasn't about hardware recovery. In the Ghost Battalion, nothing ever was. "Sir, with respect, why not send a full team?" she'd asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken aloud. "Because, Nightshade, you're the only pilot we have who can get in and out without starting World War III. The Russians know your aircraft, they know your reputation. They won't shoot first and ask questions later." The reputation. It followed her everywhere, a double-edged sword that had saved her life as often as it had complicated it. The Syrian operation 2 years ago, when she'd single-handedly extracted a compromised CIA asset from Damascus, while under fire from both Russian and Syrian forces. The Libyan incident, where she'd held off 3 attack helicopters with nothing but superior flying, and what the after-action report had diplomatically called creative use of terrain. But Hendricks wasn't telling her everything. In the Ghost Battalion, the mission briefing was always just the beginning of the story. The real objectives came later, usually when you were already committed and couldn't turn back. "There's something else," Hendricks had continued, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "If things go sideways, if you can't complete the primary mission, you're to open this. Not before. Understood?" Vera had nodded, slipping the envelope into her flight suit. Standard operating procedure for Black operations. The envelope contained either extraction coordinates or termination orders, depending on how badly things went wrong. Now, pressed against the destroyed tank with 3 Black Hawks hovering in the distance, she wondered if it was time to open that envelope. The helicopter crews were definitely confused. Through the heat shimmer, Vera could see them maintaining their hover pattern, but the crew chiefs were animated, pointing and gesturing at something in the wreckage field. She followed their gaze and realized what had stopped them cold. 20 meters to her left, partially buried in the sand, lay the twisted remains of her helicopter. An A-64 Apache, its rotor blades shattered, its fuselage blackened by fire. But it wasn't just any Apache. Even from this distance, even burned and broken, the aircraft bore the distinctive modifications of the Ghost Battalion: reinforced armor, extended-range fuel tanks, and most tellingly, the complete absence of any identifying markings. The helicopter was a ghost, just like its pilot. But more than that, it was a symbol. The Ghost Battalion's aircraft were legendary among military aviators, spoken of in whispers and denied in official channels. To see one destroyed was to witness the end of a myth, the mortality of something that was supposed to be invincible. The crew chiefs weren't just looking at wreckage, they were looking at their own possible future. Vera pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the tank, using the moment of their hesitation to assess her options. The sealed envelope in her flight suit pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The primary mission, recovering the drone, had been completed. The device was now secure in her pack, its classified payload intact. But the extraction had gone wrong when a Russian patrol had stumbled across her landing site. The firefight had been brief but intense. Her Apache had taken a direct hit from an RPG, forcing her to auto-rotate into the wreckage field. She'd managed to walk away from the crash, but the helicopter was a total loss. More importantly, it was evidence of American Black operations in Syrian territory. Evidence that 3 Black Hawks full of special operations soldiers had been sent to eliminate. The lead helicopter finally broke the hover pattern, moving slowly toward her position. As it approached, Vera could see the door gunner tracking his weapon across the wreckage field, searching for targets. Standard procedure for a combat zone, but something about the movement seemed more deliberate, more personal. Through the dust kicked up by the rotor wash, she caught a glimpse of the crew chief's face. Young, maybe 25, with the kind of sharp awareness that came from too many combat deployments. He was scanning the wreckage with professional interest, but when his eyes fell on the destroyed Apache, his expression changed. Recognition, and something else, something that looked almost like respect. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made Vera's heart skip. She'd thought the device was dead, but apparently it had just been overwhelmed by the interference from the burning wreckage. Now, as the fires died down and the metal cooled, the frequencies were clearing. "Nightshade, Nightshade, this is Reaper 6. Do you copy?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the kind of measured calm that came from years of combat operations. Vera hesitated before responding. In the Ghost Battalion, you never acknowledged a call sign you didn't recognize. But with 3 helicopters circling her position, silence wasn't much of an option. "Reaper 6, this is Nightshade, I copy." "Nightshade, what is your status?" The question was loaded with implications. Status could mean anything from combat effectiveness to mission readiness to simple survival. In the Black Operations world, the same word could be a request for information or a death sentence. Reaper 6, I am mobile and mission complete. Aircraft is a total loss. A pause. In the background, she could hear the crew talking, their voices too low to make out individual words but the tone suggesting heated discussion. Someone was arguing about something, and whatever it was important enough to delay a combat operation. Nightshade, we need you to confirm your identity. State your service number and date of commission. Standard verification protocol, but the timing was suspicious. They'd found her position, identified her wreckage, and now they needed to confirm who she was. Either this was the most thorough extraction team in military history, or they were stalling while they decided what to do with her. Vera provided the requested information, watching as the helicopters maintained their distant hover. The crew chief in the lead aircraft was still studying the wreckage field, but now he was using binoculars, focusing on specific details, looking for something that would tell him who she really was. Nightshade, stand by for authentication. More delays, more discussion, and through it all, the helicopters remained perfectly positioned to either extract her or eliminate her, depending on how the authentication went. The sealed envelope in her pocket seemed to pulse with potential answers. Hendricks had been clear, only open it if things went sideways. But how sideways did things need to get before survival trumped operational security? The radio crackled again. Nightshade, we need you to describe the insignia on your flight suit. The question hit her like a physical blow. The insignia, the patch that had been hastily removed before the mission, leaving only a faded outline on her shoulder. The Ghost Battalion insignia that officially didn't exist but was instantly recognizable to anyone who moved in the Black Operations world. They weren't trying to authenticate her identity. They were trying to confirm her allegiance. The insignia question hung in the air like a suspended death sentence. Vera looked down at her flight suit, at the pale outline where the Ghost Battalion patch had been removed. The shape was still visible, a phantom reminder of loyalties that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Reaper 6, negative on visible insignia. Unit markings were removed prior to mission execution. Another pause, longer this time. The crew chief had lowered his binoculars and was speaking intently into his helmet microphone. Whatever he was reporting was causing a stir in the command structure. The Ghost Battalion's reputation preceded them everywhere they went. Officially, they were a logistics unit responsible for transportation and supply. Unofficially, they were the military's most elite aviation unit, handling missions that regular forces couldn't touch. Their pilots were drawn from the best of the best, volunteers who had been burned by the conventional military and had nowhere else to go. Vera had joined them after the Belarus incident, a humanitarian mission that had gone wrong when Russian forces had opened fire on refugees. She'd violated direct orders to engage, saving 300 civilians but creating an international incident that had made her persona non grata in regular aviation circles. The Ghost Battalion had recruited her that same week. Nightshade, we're going to need you to come into the open. Move to the clearing 50 meters north of your position. The request was reasonable, tactically sound, and potentially fatal. The clearing would give them a clear shot at her, but it would also expose her to any remaining enemy forces in the area. More importantly, it would put her in a position where she couldn't retreat or seek cover. Reaper 6, negative. Area is not secure. Maintain current position. Nightshade, this is Colonel Hayes, Mission Commander. You will comply with the extraction order or be considered hostile. The name hit her like a hammer blow. Colonel Sarah Hayes, commander of the 75th Ranger Regiment Special Operations Aviation Battalion. A legend in her own right, known for her aggressive tactics and zero-tolerance approach to mission failure. If Hayes was running this operation, it meant the mission had been escalated to the highest levels of command. But it also meant something else. Hayes was known for her absolute loyalty to her people. She wouldn't eliminate a friendly operator without cause, but she also wouldn't hesitate to do what was necessary to protect national security. The envelope in Vera's pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Whatever was in there, whatever final orders Hendricks had given her, might be the only thing standing between her and a bullet. She looked at the Apache's wreckage again, at the twisted metal and burned avionics. Somewhere in that destruction were the answers to questions that powerful people didn't want asked. Questions about who had really ordered the mission, who had known about the Russian patrol, and who had decided that a ghost battalion pilot was expendable. The radio crackled again. "Nightshade, you have 30 seconds to comply." Time was running out. The helicopters were repositioning, their door gunners getting ready to provide covering fire. In 30 seconds, she would either be extracted or eliminated, and the choice was entirely hers. Her hand moved to the sealed envelope, fingers tracing the edges of paper that contained her fate. The envelope's wax seal bore the Ghost Battalion's unofficial insignia, a stylized hawk in flight, its wings spread wide, its eyes focused on some distant target. Vera had seen the symbol thousands of times, on aircraft, on uniforms, on classified documents that disappeared as soon as they were read. But now, feeling it beneath her fingertips, it seemed to carry the weight of all her past missions, all her questionable orders, all her moral compromises. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Hendricks' careful script. No official letterhead, no classification markings, just words that changed everything. "Nightshade, if you're reading this, the mission has been compromised. The drone recovery was a cover story. Your real mission was to be discovered by Russian forces, creating a plausible deniability incident. Your extraction team has orders to eliminate you to protect operational security. The Apache's destruction was always part of the plan. Trust no one. Find another way home. Ironside." The words swam in front of her eyes as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. She hadn't been sent to recover intelligence. She'd been sent to die. The Ghost Battalion, the unit that had given her purpose after the Belarus incident, had used her as a disposable asset in some larger game that she couldn't even comprehend. But Hendricks had warned her. The man who had recruited her, trained her, and sent her on countless missions had found a way to save her life even as he sent her to her death. The contradiction was so perfectly aligned with the Ghost Battalion's operational philosophy that it almost made her laugh. Almost. The radio crackled again. "Nightshade, time's up. Move to the clearing now." 20 meters away, the lead helicopter was descending, its skids almost touching the sand. The crew chief was gesturing urgently, his hand on his weapon but not yet raising it. They were still hopping for compliance, still hopping to make this clean and simple. Vera folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. The drone's payload was still secure in her pack, whatever secrets it contained now secondary to the larger question of survival. If the mission had been compromised from the beginning, if her own people had set her up, then the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. She keyed the radio one last time. "Reaper 6, this is Nightshade. I'm moving to the clearing." But instead of heading north to the designated extraction point, she moved south, deeper into the wreckage field. The destroyed vehicles would provide cover, and more importantly, they would mask her heat signature from the helicopter's thermal imaging systems. Behind her, she could hear the crew chief's voice change from urgent to alarmed. "She's moving the wrong direction. Say again, target is moving south into the wreckage field." The hunt was on. The destroyed convoy stretched for almost a kilometer, a testament to the effectiveness of whatever force had intercepted the Russian patrol. Vera moved between the vehicles like a ghost, using their bulk to shield herself from the helicopter's sensors. Each piece of wreckage told a story of violence and tactical precision, but she didn't have time to read the battlefield. Above her, the Blackhawks were spreading out, establishing a perimeter that would prevent her from escaping the wreckage field. Standard search and destroy tactics, executed with the kind of professional competence that would have impressed her under different circumstances. But Vera had advantages that the helicopter crews didn't know about. 3 years of flying with the Ghost Battalion had taught her things that weren't in any manual: how to move unseen in hostile territory, how to use the environment as a weapon, how to survive when everyone wanted you dead. The radio chatter was becoming more urgent. Thermal signature is intermittent. She's using the wreckage to mask her position. Roger that. Reaper 2, establish overwatch on the south perimeter. Reaper 3, move to blocking position on the east side. Reaper 6, this is Reaper 2. We've got movement in the wreckage field, but we can't get a clean shot. Too much interference from the burning vehicles. Colonel Hayes' voice cut through the chatter like a blade. All stations, this is Reaper 6. Target is considered hostile. Weapons free on my command. Weapons free. The words that transformed a search and rescue operation into a termination order. Whatever political calculations had led to this moment, whatever games were being played at levels far above her pay grade, the end result was simple. She was now fair game. Vera paused behind the burned-out hull of a BTR-80 armored personnel carrier, checking her equipment. The drone's payload was secure, her sidearm was loaded, and she had enough water for maybe 6 hours in the desert heat. Not much to work with, but she'd survived worse odds. The key was changing the rules of engagement. Right now, she was playing their game, reacting to their moves, running from their superior firepower. But the Ghost Battalion had taught her that the only way to win an unwinnable fight was to make the enemy fight on your terms. She pulled out her radio and switched to the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, this is American pilot under fire by hostile forces. Coordinates 36 degrees 15 N, 38 degrees 42 E. Requesting immediate assistance. The transmission went out on the international distress frequency, monitored by military forces from at least 6 different nations. In the complex airspace over Syria, where Russian, American, Turkish, and Israeli aircraft operated in an uneasy balance, a mayday call from an American pilot would create exactly the kind of international incident that black operations were designed to avoid. Above her, the helicopter chatter immediately shifted from tactical coordination to damage control. Reaper 6, we've got a mayday transmission on emergency frequency. Target is broadcasting our position. Shut it down now. Negative, sir. Transmission is on emergency frequency. We can't jam it without affecting our own communications. Vera smiled grimly. The first rule of asymmetric warfare: use the enemy's strengths against them. The Blackhawks' sophisticated communication systems, designed to give them tactical superiority, were now a liability that connected them to monitoring stations across the Middle East. She transmitted again. Mayday, Mayday, this is Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kovalenko, United States Air Force. I am being engaged by hostile forces using American aircraft. Request immediate assistance from any friendly forces in the area. The use of her real name, her real rank, was a calculated risk. It would expose her identity to intelligence services around the world, but it would also make her disappearance much harder to explain. The response to her mayday call was immediate and electric. Within minutes, the emergency frequency was buzzing with activity as military forces across the region reacted to the possibility of an American pilot under fire. Turkish F-16 scrambled from Incirlik Air Base. Russian Su-35s lifted off from H-Mamam. Israeli F-35s appeared on radar screens, their stealth signatures deliberately made visible as a show of force. The simple distress call had transformed the tactical situation from a covert elimination to an international incident in real time. Above her, the Blackhawks were struggling to adapt to the new reality. Their mission parameters had been designed for a quick, clean operation in the middle of nowhere. Now they were operating under the scrutiny of half a dozen air forces, their every move monitored by intelligence services that were suddenly very interested in why American Special Operations Forces were hunting one of their own pilots. Reaper 6, this is Overlord. Abort mission immediately. Return to base. Colonel Hayes' response was immediate and predictable. Overlord, mission is not complete. Target is still in the area. Reaper 6, you have multiple foreign aircraft converging on your position. Mission is abort. I say again, abort. The pause that followed was filled with the weight of careers ending and political calculations being recalculated in real time. Hayes was a professional soldier who had been given an impossible mission and was now being asked to abandon it just when success seemed within reach. But she was also smart enough to recognize when the game had changed beyond recovery. All stations, this is Reaper 6. Mission abort, return to base. The helicopters began to pull back, their rotor wash gradually diminishing as they gained altitude. But Vera didn't move from her position behind the armored vehicle. She'd won the first round, but the war was far from over. The Ghost Battalion had tried to kill her once. They would try again. The radio crackled with a new voice, speaking in accented English. American pilot, this is Russian Air Force Colonel Petrov. We are monitoring your distress call. State your status and location. The offer of help from an enemy pilot was as surreal as it was dangerous. In the complex geopolitics of the Syrian conflict, yesterday's enemy could become today's ally, but the price of that alliance was always unclear. Vera keyed the radio carefully. Russian pilot, this is American pilot. I am uninjured and mobile. My aircraft was destroyed in ground fire. I am requesting safe passage to neutral territory. American pilot, understand your aircraft was destroyed. Are you able to move to extraction point? The question was loaded with implications. If she accepted Russian help, she would be admitting that American forces had been operating illegally in Syrian airspace. But if she refused, she would be alone in hostile territory with her own people hunting her. The choice was between betraying her country and being betrayed by it. Russian pilot, I'm able to move to extraction point. What are your intentions? A pause, then, American pilot, my intentions are to help fellow aviator. Politics is for politicians. Pilots help pilots. The simple humanity of the statement cut through the complexity of international relations like a knife. Colonel Petrov, whoever he was offering the kind of professional courtesy that transcended national boundaries. The brotherhood of aviators that said some things were more important than flags and orders. The extraction point that Colonel Petrov designated was a small plateau 15 kilometers south of the wreckage field. Far enough from the Syrian border to be neutral territory, but close enough to reach on foot before the desert heat became lethal. As Vera began her trek across the broken terrain, she could hear the distinctive sound of Russian helicopters approaching from the north. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of training to fight Russian forces, she was now depending on them for survival. The Ghost Battalion had taught her that enemies were just friends you hadn't met yet, but she'd never expected to test that philosophy so literally. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In a few hours, the temperature would drop dramatically, transforming the killing heat into manageable cold. But she needed to reach the extraction point before then, before the thermal imaging systems of any pursuing forces could pick up her body heat against the cooling sand. Behind her, the wreckage field was already fading into heat shimmer and memory. The destroyed Apache, the evidence of her betrayal, the classified payload that had started this entire mess, all of it was disappearing into the vast indifference of the desert. But the drone's payload was still in her pack, and whatever secrets it contained were now her only bargaining chip in a game she still didn't fully understand. The radio crackled again. "American pilot, this is Petrov. We have visual on your position. Continue south to the plateau. We will provide overwatch." Above her, she could see the Russian helicopters maintaining a respectful distance. Two Mi-24 Hinds, their shark-like silhouettes unmistakable against the darkening sky. Attack helicopters, but flying in escort formation rather than combat spread. The professional courtesy was remarkable. In the middle of a proxy war, with tensions running high and trigger fingers itchy, two enemies were cooperating on the simple principle that pilots helped pilots. "Russian pilot, this is American pilot. I have visual on your aircraft. Thank you for the escort." "American pilot, it is my pleasure. We will have you safe soon." The plateau was visible now, a rocky outcrop that rose perhaps 50 meters above the desert floor, perfect for a helicopter landing, with good visibility in all directions. As she climbed the rough trail toward the summit, Vera could hear the Russian helicopters repositioning themselves for the pickup. But she could also hear something else, a new sound, barely audible over the rotor noise, the high-pitched whine of jet engines coming from the south, fast movers traveling at high altitude, probably supersonic. The cavalry was arriving, but whose cavalry remained to be seen. At the top of the plateau, she found Colonel Petrov waiting for her. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of flying in harsh conditions. His flight suit was different from hers, Russian manufacture, different pockets, different insignia, but the expression in his eyes was instantly familiar. The look of a pilot who had seen too much and flown too long. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko," he said in heavily accented English. "I am Colonel Alexei Petrov, Russian Air Force. It is honor to meet you." "Colonel Petrov, thank you for the extraction." He gestured toward his helicopter, where the crew chief was already preparing for immediate departure. "Is nothing. We must go quickly. Your people are very determined to find you." The flight to the extraction point took them over terrain that Vera had never seen from this perspective. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional road or cluster of buildings. From 1,000 feet up, the Syrian conflict looked almost peaceful, the violence and suffering reduced to abstract patterns of light and shadow. But Colonel Petrov was right about one thing. The American forces were determined to find her. The radio chatter on the emergency frequency was constant now, with multiple agencies coordinating search efforts. The official story was that an American pilot had been downed and was missing in action. The reality was that a political problem needed to be solved before it became a diplomatic crisis. "Colonel," Petrov said over the intercom, "may I ask what happened to your aircraft?" The question was innocent enough, but Vera knew that anything she said would be reported back to Russian intelligence. The truth about the Ghost Battalion, about the mission to recover the drone, about the betrayal that had led to her current situation, all of it would be analyzed and used by people who were professionally interested in American military capabilities. "Equipment failure," she said simply. "The aircraft went down during a routine patrol." Petrov nodded, but his expression suggested he didn't believe her. In the world of military aviation, there was no such thing as a routine patrol over hostile territory. Every mission was calculated, every flight path deliberate, every risk assessed by committees of people who would never pull the trigger themselves. "Equipment failure," he repeated. "Yes, sometimes equipment fails at very inconvenient times." The comment was loaded with implication. Petrov was a professional pilot who had spent years flying in combat zones. He knew the difference between mechanical failure and enemy action, between accident and intention. But he was also a gentleman who understood that some questions were better left unasked. The helicopter began its descent toward a small airfield that appeared to be deserted. A single runway, a few prefabricated buildings, and no visible activity. But as they approached, Vera could see that the facility was actually bustling with carefully concealed activity. Personnel moved between buildings with the kind of purposeful efficiency that spoke of military training, and the aircraft on the ground bore the markings of multiple nations. "Where are we?" she asked. "Neutral territory," Petrov replied. "A place where pilots can be pilots without worrying about politics." The helicopter touched down with the gentle precision that marked a skilled pilot. As the rotor spun down, Vera could see figures approaching from the main building. Men and women in various uniforms, representing different nations but united by the common language of aviation. Colonel Petrov shut down the engines and removed his helmet. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko, welcome to the International Aviation Emergency Response Center. Here, you are safe." The facility was impressive in its simplicity. A neutral zone established by international treaty, where downed pilots could be processed and repatriated without the complications of national politics. The kind of place that existed in the gray areas of international law, supported by people who understood that some principles transcended borders. But Vera knew that her situation was more complicated than a simple emergency response. The drone's payload in her pack contained secrets that multiple governments would kill to protect or expose. The Ghost Battalion's betrayal had transformed her from a military asset into a political liability. Safe was a relative term. The debriefing room was deliberately neutral, decorated with the flags of dozens of nations, but dominated by none. Vera sat across from a panel of 3 officers: Colonel Petrov, a Turkish colonel whose name she hadn't caught, and a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Ms. Chen from the International Red Cross. The questions were predictable and carefully phrased: her name, rank, and service number, the circumstances of her aircraft's destruction, her current physical and mental condition. Standard processing for a downed pilot, but with an undercurrent of tension that suggested everyone in the room knew this was anything but standard. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko," Ms. Chen said, "we need to discuss the circumstances of your rescue. The emergency frequency recordings indicate that you were being pursued by American forces. Can you explain this?" The question was the diplomatic equivalent of stepping on a landmine. Anything she said would be analyzed, dissected, and used by intelligence services around the world. The truth about the Ghost Battalion would expose American black operations. A lie would be detected and would damage her credibility. "I was separated from my unit during a combat operation," she said carefully. "Communications were disrupted, and there may have been confusion about my status." Colonel Petrov leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant Colonel, we monitored the radio traffic. The American forces were using terminology consistent with a hostile engagement. They were not attempting to rescue you." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Petrov was forcing her to confront the reality of her situation, to acknowledge that her own people had tried to kill her. "I cannot speculate about the intentions of other units," she replied. "I can only report what happened to me." The Turkish colonel spoke for the first time. "Lieutenant Colonel, we have been monitoring unusual American air activity in this region for several weeks. Special operations flights, unscheduled reconnaissance missions, activities that suggest a significant operation was underway. Are you able to comment on this?" Another landmine. The truth about the Ghost Battalion's operations would compromise ongoing missions and endanger other personnel. But a lie would be obvious to intelligence professionals who had been tracking those same operations. "I'm not authorized to discuss operational details," she said. Ms. Chen made a note on her tablet. "Lieutenant Colonel, we understand your position, but we need to determine how to proceed with your repatriation. The American government has made several requests for your immediate return, but they have been unable to provide adequate assurances about your safety. The implication was clear. The neutral zone was protecting her from her own government, at least temporarily. But that protection came with conditions and limitations that she was only beginning to understand. "What kind of assurances?" she asked. "Assurances that you will not be subjected to disciplinary action for the circumstances of your rescue. Assurances that your testimony about recent events will not be suppressed. Assurances that your career will not be terminated as a result of this incident." Each assurance was a recognition that her situation was fundamentally different from a normal emergency repatriation. She wasn't just a downed pilot. She was a witness to something that powerful people wanted to remain secret. The drone's payload seemed to grow heavier in her pack with each passing moment. The sleeping quarters were Spartan but comfortable, designed for the temporary housing of personnel from different military traditions. Vera lay on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the day's events. 12 hours ago, she'd been a ghost battalion pilot on a routine recovery mission. Now she was an international incident. The drone's payload sat on the small desk, its classified contents still sealed inside the military-grade container. Whatever secrets it held, whatever information had been worth risking her life to recover, it was now the only leverage she had in a game that was far larger than she'd imagined. She'd been betrayed by her own people, saved by her enemies, and was now being protected by neutrals who had their own agendas. The simple certainties of military service, follow orders, complete the mission, trust your chain of command, had been replaced by a complex web of competing interests and hidden motivations. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Lieutenant Colonel, this is Colonel Petrov. May I come in?" She opened the door to find the Russian pilot holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he had something important to discuss. "Colonel Petrov, what can I do for you?" He handed her one of the cups and gestured toward the small table. "I was hoping we might speak privately about your situation." They sat across from each other, 2 pilots from opposing sides of a global conflict, sharing coffee and trying to navigate the complexities of international relations on a personal level. "You are in very difficult position," Petrov said without preamble. "Your government wants you back, but they also want to silence you. My government is very interested in what you might know about American operations in Syria, and you, I think, just want to survive." The assessment was brutally accurate. Vera sipped her coffee, studying the Russian colonel's face. He had the kind of weathered features that came from years of flying in combat zones, but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested he understood the larger game being played around them. "What are you proposing, Colonel?" "I am proposing that we help each other. You have information that would be valuable to my government. I have the ability to ensure your safe passage to a country of your choosing, a mutually beneficial arrangement." The offer was tempting, but Vera knew that accepting Russian help would make her a traitor in the eyes of her own government. The Ghost Battalion had tried to kill her, but that didn't make the Russians her friends. "I'm not interested in defecting, Colonel." Petrov smiled. "I am not asking you to defect. I am asking you to survive. There is difference." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your Ghost Battalion, they have been very active in our airspace. Very professional, very skilled, but also very dangerous. My government would like to know more about their capabilities, their missions, their objectives. In exchange, we can provide you with new identity, new life, far from people who want you dead." The drone's payload seemed to pulse with significance. Whatever was contained in that sealed container, it was valuable enough that the Russians were willing to offer her a new life in exchange for it. "And if I refuse?" "Then you go back to your people, and you hope that their need for silence is not greater than their concern for your welfare." The choice was stark. betray her country to save her life, or trust the people who had already tried to kill her once. I need time to think. Petrov nodded and stood to leave. Of course, but do not take too long. Your government is applying pressure for your immediate return. The neutral zone cannot protect you indefinitely. As he reached the door, he paused. Lieutenant Colonel, may I ask you something? What made you join the Ghost Battalion? The question was unexpected and personal. Vera found herself answering honestly. I wanted to make a difference, to fly missions that mattered, to serve something larger than myself. And now I'm not sure what I was serving. Petrov nodded sadly. This is the curse of the professional soldier. We serve our countries so faithfully that we forget to ask if our countries deserve our service. After he left, Vera sat alone with her coffee and her doubts. The Ghost Battalion had recruited her after the Belarus incident, when she'd violated orders to save civilian lives. They'd promised her a chance to make a real difference, to use her skills in service of something meaningful. But the mission briefing had been built on lies. The extraction team had been sent to kill her. Even Hendricks, the man who had recruited her, had been part of the deception, even as he tried to save her life. The drone's payload represented everything she'd thought she was fighting for: classified information that could affect national security, secrets that needed to be protected from enemy forces. But it also represented the betrayal of everything she'd believed about duty, honor, and service. She opened the container. The payload wasn't what she'd expected. Instead of the high-tech intelligence device she'd been briefed about, the container held a simple tablet computer and a stack of printed documents, the kind of materials that could be found in any office building, unremarkable except for the classification markings that covered every page. The documents were financial records, bank transfers, weapons purchases, payments to contractors whose names she didn't recognize. But as she read through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. The Ghost Battalion wasn't just conducting military operations. They were running a private war, funded by sources that had nothing to do with the American government. Arms dealers, defense contractors, private military companies, the kind of people who profited from conflict and had a vested interest in keeping wars going. The Ghost Battalion had become their personal air force, conducting operations that served corporate interests rather than national security. The tablet contained more detailed information, mission reports that had been altered before being submitted to official channels, operational plans that had been designed to destabilize regions rather than protect American interests, evidence of war crimes that had been covered up by people who wore the same uniform she did. Vera felt sick. The missions she'd flown, the people she'd killed, the risks she'd taken, all of it had been in service of a lie. The Ghost Battalion wasn't an elite military unit. It was a criminal organization that had been masquerading as patriots. The Belarus incident suddenly made sense. She'd been recruited not because of her skills or her commitment to service, but because she'd already demonstrated a willingness to violate orders when her conscience demanded it. They'd wanted someone who could be manipulated, someone who would follow orders without questioning their ultimate purpose, someone who would make the perfect scapegoat when the operation finally fell apart. The knock on her door was more urgent this time. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko, this is Ms. Chen. We need to speak with you immediately." Vera quickly sealed the documents back in the container and opened the door. The Red Cross representative looked troubled, her usual diplomatic composure replaced by obvious concern. "Lieutenant Colonel, we've received word that American forces are demanding your immediate return. They've threatened to revoke the neutral zone's international recognition if you're not transferred within the next 6 hours." The ultimatum was exactly what Vera had expected. The Ghost Battalion couldn't allow her to remain in international custody, where she might be debriefed by foreign intelligence services. They needed her back under American control, where her testimony could be managed and her knowledge contained. What are my options? Officially, you have no options. The neutral zone exists at the pleasure of the international community, and the American government has significant influence over that community. But unofficially, Ms. Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. There are people who believe that your safety is more important than diplomatic convenience. The implication was clear. The neutral zone was willing to help her disappear, but only if she was willing to abandon her identity as an American military officer. What would that involve? New identity, new citizenship, a chance to start over in a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, but you would never be able to return home, never be able to contact your family, never be able to resume your old life. The choice was between certain death and living death. Return to American custody and face elimination by the Ghost Battalion, or disappear forever and live as a stranger in a strange land. How long do I have to decide? 4 hours. After that, we'll have to transfer you to American custody. Ms. Chen left, and Vera was alone again with her impossible choice. The documents in the container represented evidence of massive corruption and criminal activity. If she could get them to the right people, she might be able to expose the Ghost Battalion and prevent other soldiers from being used as she had been. But the right people were increasingly difficult to identify. If the Ghost Battalion had been operating with impunity for years, they had to have protection at the highest levels of government. Releasing the documents might not bring justice. It might just get more people killed. The radio on her desk crackled to life. "Nightshade, this is Ironside. Do you copy?" Colonel Hendrick's voice, transmitted on an encrypted frequency that shouldn't have been able to reach the neutral zone. Vera hesitated before responding. The man who had recruited her, trained her, and ultimately betrayed her was somehow still trying to communicate with her. "Ironside, this is Nightshade. I copy." "Nightshade, we need to talk." The conversation with Hendricks was conducted on a secure channel that bypassed the neutral zone's communication systems. Vera found herself speaking to the man who had shaped her career and nearly ended her life, trying to understand how he could have done both. "Nightshade, I know you've read the documents. I know you understand what the Ghost Battalion really is. Sir, I understand that you tried to have me killed. I tried to save your life. The extraction team was sent to eliminate you, but I made sure you had the information you needed to survive. The envelope, the warning about the mission being compromised, that was my way of giving you a chance." The explanation was typically complex, typical of the moral ambiguity that defined the Ghost Battalion. Hendricks had betrayed her by sending her on a suicide mission, but he'd also saved her by giving her the tools to survive it. "Sir, why? Why did you recruit me if you knew what the battalion really was?" A pause, then, "Because I thought I could change it from the inside. Because I believed that good people could make a corrupt system serve a righteous purpose. Because I was wrong." The admission carried the weight of years of moral compromise. Hendricks had been trying to use the Ghost Battalion's resources to conduct legitimate operations, but he'd been fighting a losing battle against people who saw war as a business opportunity. "The mission to recover the drone was my attempt to gather evidence. The payload you recovered contains everything we need to expose the entire network, but powerful people know that evidence exists, and they're willing to kill to protect it. Including killing me. Including killing you, and me, and anyone else who knows the truth." The radio crackled with interference, suggesting that someone was trying to jam the signal. Their conversation was being monitored, and forces were moving to prevent it from continuing. "Nightshade, you have a choice to make. You can turn over the evidence to the authorities and hope that justice prevails, or you can disappear and hope that silence keeps you alive. But you cannot do both." "What would you do, sir?" Another pause, longer this time. I would do what I should have done years ago. I would make sure the truth came out, regardless of the cost to myself. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Vera alone with her thoughts and her impossible choice. The evidence in the container could expose massive corruption and prevent other soldiers from being used as she had been, but releasing it would make her a target for the rest of her life. The knock on her door was softer this time. Colonel Petrov returned with another offer of help. "Lieutenant Colonel, I believe your situation has become more complicated." "How so?" "Your government has just announced that you are wanted for treason. Apparently, you are accused of stealing classified materials and collaborating with foreign intelligence services." The announcement was the final move in a game that had been rigged from the beginning. By accusing her of treason, the Ghost Battalion had transformed her from a whistleblower into a criminal. Even if she managed to expose their corruption, her testimony would be discredited by the treason charges. "The neutral zone can no longer protect you," Petrov continued. "But my government can. We are prepared to offer you asylum in exchange for your cooperation." The offer was tempting, but Vera knew that accepting Russian help would validate the treason charges and make her a propaganda tool for Moscow. She would be trading one form of exploitation for another. "I need to think about it." "Of course, but perhaps while you are thinking, you might consider that there are other options, other ways to ensure that the truth comes out without sacrificing your life." Petrov handed her a small device that looked like a smartphone. "This contains contact information for journalists, investigators, and human rights organizations around the world, people who specialize in exposing government corruption and protecting whistleblowers. If you choose to release the evidence, they can help you do it safely." The device represented a third option that she hadn't considered. Instead of choosing between the American government and the Russian government, she could choose to serve something larger than any government. She could choose to serve the truth. But that choice came with its own risks and uncertainties. Once the evidence was released, she would be beyond the protection of any government. She would be alone in a world where powerful people wanted her dead. The Secure Facilities Communications Center was a maze of encrypted terminals and monitoring equipment, staffed by technicians who maintained the neutral zone's connections to the outside world. Vera sat at one of the terminals. The device Petrov had given her connected to a secure server that promised anonymity and protection. The documents from the drone's payload were spread across multiple screens, their contents more damning with each page she reviewed. Bank records showing payments to the Ghost Battalion from defense contractors. Mission reports that had been altered to hide civilian casualties. Evidence of arms deals that had prolonged conflicts in 3 different countries. But the most damaging evidence was personal. Communications between Ghost Battalion officers and their corporate sponsors, discussing how to manipulate missions to maximize profits. Conversations about which pilots were reliable and which were becoming problems. A detailed plan for eliminating problematic personnel that included her own name. The evidence was overwhelming, but releasing it would require her to trust people she'd never met with her life. The journalists and investigators that Petrov had recommended operated in the shadows, protected by nothing more than their reputation and their commitment to the truth. She began uploading the files to the secure server, watching as terabytes of classified information disappeared into the digital underground. Each document that uploaded was another step toward either justice or suicide, depending on how effectively her enemies could respond. The upload was interrupted by an alarm. Red lights flashed throughout the communications center as technicians scrambled to their stations. Through the facility's windows, she could see helicopters approaching from multiple directions. "All personnel to emergency stations," the facility's public address system announced. "We have incoming aircraft of unknown intent." The helicopters were American, Blackhawks and Apache, flying in combat formation. But they were also Russian. Mi-24 Hinds and Mi-28 attack helicopters, matching the American formation aircraft for aircraft. The neutral zone was about to become a battlefield. Ms. Chen's voice crackled over the intercom. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko, please report to the command center immediately." Vera saved her work and secured the upload device. The evidence was now in the hands of people who specialized in exposing government corruption, but whether they could act on it before she was killed remained to be seen. The command center was a study in controlled chaos. Officers from multiple nations worked side by side, trying to prevent the neutral zone from becoming the epicenter of an international incident. On the main screen, the approaching helicopters were clearly visible, their formations perfectly matched in a display of military precision that was both impressive and terrifying. "Lieutenant Colonel," Ms. Chen said, "both the American and Russian governments are demanding your immediate transfer to their custody. They're prepared to use force if necessary." The situation was unprecedented. The neutral zone had been created to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation, but the stakes had risen beyond what its founders had ever imagined. "What are my options?" "Officially, you have no options. We cannot protect you if both superpowers are determined to take you by force. But unofficially, there may be a way to resolve this without bloodshed." Colonel Petrov appeared at her shoulder. "Lieutenant Colonel, my government has authorized me to make one final offer. We will guarantee your safety in exchange for your cooperation. But you must decide now, before the situation escalates beyond control." The offer was tempting, but Vera knew that accepting it would validate every accusation that had been made against her. She would be trading her integrity for her life, and the evidence of the Ghost Battalion's corruption would be buried forever. "Thank you, Colonel, but I have to decline." Petrov nodded sadly. "I understand, but I hope you understand that this may be your last chance to survive this." The helicopters were landing now, their crews deploying with the kind of tactical precision that suggested they were prepared for armed resistance. American Special Operations Forces on one side, Russian Special Forces on the other, with the neutral zone security personnel caught in the middle. Vera realized that her choice had been made for her. The evidence was already being processed by journalists and investigators around the world. Her life was now irrelevant to the larger mission of exposing the truth. She walked toward the exit, past the startled faces of the international staff, past the weapons and equipment that represented humanity's inability to resolve conflicts peacefully. The uploaded evidence would either vindicate her actions or die with her, but at least she would die knowing that she had chosen truth over survival. The door to the landing pad opened, and she stepped into the harsh desert sunlight to face whatever came next. The landing pad was a study in controlled tension. 20 meters to her left, a squad of American Special Operations Forces had established a perimeter, their weapons ready but not raised. 20 meters to her right, Russian Special Forces had done the same, their formation mirroring the Americans with professional precision. Between them, the neutral zone security personnel tried to maintain some semblance of order, but their authority was rapidly being eroded by the presence of two superpowers' elite forces. Vera walked to the center of the pad, equidistant from both forces, and waited. The choice of where to stand was symbolic. She was refusing to choose sides in a conflict that had consumed her life and career. Colonel Hayes emerged from the lead American helicopter, her uniform crisp despite the desert heat. She was followed by a man in civilian clothes who had the kind of anonymous appearance that marked him as intelligence community. Behind them, a squad of Rangers maintained overwatch positions. From the Russian side, Colonel Petrov approached with a similarly anonymous civilian and a squad of Spetsnaz operators. The two groups moved with the kind of cautious professionalism that suggested they had rehearsed this scenario, but hoped never to execute it. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko," Hayes called out, her voice carrying clearly across the pad. "You need to come with us, now." "Lieutenant Colonel," Petrov replied, "you are welcome to accept our protection. The choice is yours." The civilians with each group were speaking rapidly into their communications devices, undoubtedly receiving instructions from their respective governments. The situation was being managed at the highest levels, but the people on the ground were the ones who would have to execute whatever decisions were made. "I have a third option," Vera said, her voice carrying to both groups. "I choose to remain here under the protection of the neutral zone." The statement was technically correct but practically meaningless. The neutral zone existed only as long as both sides agreed to respect it, and that agreement was rapidly deteriorating. Hayes stepped forward. "Lieutenant Colonel, you are a United States military officer. You have an obligation to return to American custody." "Colonel Hayes, I am a human being. I have an obligation to survive." The response was carefully chosen. By invoking her humanity rather than her nationality, Vera was making a statement that transcended military protocol. She was refusing to be treated as property of any government. Petrov nodded approvingly. "Lieutenant Colonel, humanity is indeed more important than politics, but politics, unfortunately, has more guns." The observation was accurate and depressing. The various forces surrounding the landing pad represented the ultimate failure of diplomacy, the point where reasonable people stopped talking and started shooting. The civilian with the American group spoke into his radio, then nodded to Hayes. Whatever instructions he'd received, they seemed to resolve some internal debate. "Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko," Hayes said, "you have 30 seconds to make your choice. Come with us voluntarily or be taken by force." The ultimatum was exactly what Vera had expected. The Ghost Battalion couldn't allow her to remain in international custody, where she might be debriefed by foreign intelligence services or journalists. They needed her back under American control, where her testimony could be managed and her knowledge contained. But the evidence was already in the hands of people who specialized in exposing government corruption. Her life was now irrelevant to the larger mission, but her death would become part of the story. "Colonel Hayes," she said, "I invoke my right to asylum under the Geneva Convention." The invocation was legally meaningless in this context, but it served to remind everyone present that they were potentially committing war crimes. The neutral zone was sovereign territory, and the forcible extraction of a person claiming asylum would violate multiple international treaties. Hayes looked genuinely pained. "Lieutenant Colonel, I have my orders." So did the officers at Nuremberg, Colonel. The comparison was harsh but accurate. Following orders was not a defense for actions that violated international law and basic human decency. The standoff continued for another minute, with both sides waiting for someone else to make the first move. Then the civilian with the American group received another radio transmission, one that seemed to change everything. He spoke quietly to Hayes, who nodded and stepped back. The Rangers began to lower their weapons, and the tension on the landing pad began to ease. "Lieutenant Colonel," Hayes said, "we have received new instructions. You are to be transferred to the custody of the International Criminal Court for debriefing regarding war crimes allegations." The announcement was unexpected and potentially game-changing. The International Criminal Court had jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. If they were involved, it meant that the evidence she had uploaded was being taken seriously at the highest levels of international law. The transfer to The Hague was conducted with the kind of diplomatic precision that marked truly significant international events. Vera flew in a specially configured aircraft that belonged to no single nation, escorted by fighters from multiple air forces in a display of international cooperation that was both impressive and surreal. The evidence she had uploaded was already being analyzed by prosecutors who specialized in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Ghost Battalion's activities, the corporate sponsors who had funded them, the government officials who had protected them, all of it was being dissected by people who understood that justice transcended national boundaries. But the legal process would take years, and the people responsible for the crimes would use every resource at their disposal to prevent accountability. Vieira's testimony would be crucial, but it would also make her a target for the rest of her life. The International Criminal Court was housed in a modern building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a temple of justice. But the people who worked there had dedicated their lives to the principle that some crimes were so heinous that they demanded universal condemnation. The prosecutor who interviewed her was a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Müller, a German lawyer who had spent decades pursuing war criminals around the world. She had the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko, Dr. Müller said, your evidence has already provided us with leads in 17 different countries. The Ghost Battalion's activities were far more extensive than we initially realized. The scope of the corruption was staggering. The Ghost Battalion had been operating as a private military company, conducting operations that served corporate interests rather than national security. They had prolonged conflicts to maximize profits, eliminated witnesses to protect their operations, and corrupted government officials to ensure their continued existence. What happens now? Vieira asked. Now we build cases. We issue indictments. We seek extradition of the responsible parties, and we do everything possible to ensure that this never happens again. The process would be long and difficult, but it was the only way to ensure that the Ghost Battalion's crimes didn't go unpunished. Vieira's testimony would be crucial, but she would also need protection from people who had already tried to kill her once. Dr. Müller, I need to ask you something. Will my testimony be enough to bring them to justice? The prosecutor's expression was carefully neutral. Lieutenant Colonel, I cannot guarantee outcomes, but I can guarantee that your evidence will be thoroughly investigated and that every legal avenue will be pursued. The answer was honest but not reassuring. The Ghost Battalion had powerful friends and unlimited resources. They would fight the charges with every weapon at their disposal, including attempts to discredit or eliminate the witnesses against them. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the determination of the international community to hold war criminals accountable. The evidence Vieira had provided was already being corroborated by other sources, and the web of corruption was unraveling faster than its creators could contain it. The knock on the interview room door was gentle but insistent. A court security officer entered with a message that seemed to surprise Dr. Müller. Lieutenant Colonel, we have received word that several Ghost Battalion officers have been arrested in different countries. The evidence you provided has allowed us to coordinate simultaneous operations against the entire network. The news was better than Vieira had dared hope. The Ghost Battalion's leadership was being systematically dismantled, their corporate sponsors were being investigated, and their government protectors were being exposed. But she also knew that the organization had been built to survive exactly this kind of assault. There would be backup plans, alternative funding sources, and contingency operations designed to continue the mission, even if the leadership was eliminated. Dr. Müller, what about the other pilots, the ones who are still flying missions for the battalion? We are working with multiple governments to identify and protect personnel who may have been used as you were. Your testimony has helped us understand how the organization recruited and manipulated its members. The protection of other pilots was as important as the prosecution of the leadership. The Ghost Battalion had used good people to do bad things, and those people deserved a chance to redeem themselves. As the interview continued, Vera found herself thinking about the future. The legal process would take years, but eventually, the truth would come out. The Ghost Battalion's crimes would be exposed, their leaders would be held accountable, and the system that had allowed them to operate would be reformed. But the cost had been enormous. Countless lives lost, multiple countries destabilized, and the trust between military personnel and their leadership fundamentally damaged. The price of justice was always high, but the price of injustice was higher. 6 months later, Vera sat in a small apartment in Geneva, watching the news coverage of the latest arrests in the Ghost Battalion case. The investigation had expanded to include dozens of countries and hundreds of suspects, becoming the largest international prosecution of military contractors in history. The apartment was under the protection of the International Criminal Court, but she knew that protection was temporary. Eventually, she would have to build a new life, far from the world of military aviation that had defined her for so long. The evidence she had provided had been corroborated by dozens of other sources. Former Ghost Battalion pilots who had come forward with their own stories of manipulation and betrayal. Corporate executives who had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Government officials who had finally decided that their careers were less important than their consciences. But the legal process was slow, and the people responsible for the crimes were using every resource at their disposal to prevent accountability. High-priced lawyers, political influence, and media manipulation were all being deployed to discredit the investigation and protect the guilty. The knock on her door was expected. Dr. Mueller, arriving for their weekly briefing on the case's progress. "Lieutenant Colonel," the prosecutor said, "I have good news and bad news. Good news first. We have secured indictments against 17 senior Ghost Battalion officers, including Colonel Hendricks. The evidence you provided has been instrumental in building these cases." The news about Hendricks was particularly significant. The man who had recruited her, trained her, and ultimately tried to save her was now facing charges for his role in the organization's crimes. And the bad news. 3 of our key witnesses have been killed in what appear to be accidents. We believe the Ghost Battalion's remaining operatives are systematically eliminating people who can testify against them. The murders were a reminder that the organization was still operational, still dangerous, and still willing to kill to protect its secrets. Vera's protection detail was increased, but she knew that no amount of security could guarantee her safety indefinitely. "Dr. Mueller, how much longer before the trials begin?" "At least another year, maybe 2. The defense attorneys are filing every possible motion to delay the proceedings, and the political implications are complicating the international cooperation we need." The delay was frustrating but predictable. The Ghost Battalion's crimes involved multiple governments, and those governments were reluctant to admit that they had been infiltrated by a criminal organization. But the investigation was also having unexpected positive effects. Military contractors around the world were being subjected to increased scrutiny. Government oversight of black operations was being strengthened. And most importantly, the culture of secrecy that had allowed the Ghost Battalion to operate was being challenged. "Lieutenant Colonel, I need to ask you about something. We've received reports that you've been in contact with other former Ghost Battalion pilots. Is this true?" The question was delicate. Vera had indeed been reaching out to other pilots, trying to convince them to come forward with their own testimonies. But she was also potentially compromising the investigation by acting independently. "Yes, Dr. Mueller. I've been talking to people who were in the same situation I was. They deserve to know that there's a way out. I understand your motivation, but you're putting yourself at risk. The Ghost Battalion is still operational, and they're actively hunting for people who might testify against them." The warning was necessary but incomplete. Vera was already at risk simply by existing. The Ghost Battalion couldn't allow her to testify, regardless of what she did or didn't do. Dr. Mueller, I'm going to keep reaching out to those pilots. They have a right to know that someone is fighting for them. The prosecutor nodded reluctantly. Then we'll have to increase your protection. But please be careful. The people we're prosecuting have killed for less. As Dr. Mueller left, Vera returned to her computer, where encrypted messages from former Ghost Battalion pilots were waiting. Each message was a story of manipulation, betrayal, and moral compromise. Each pilot was a person who had joined the military to serve their country and had been used to serve corporate interests instead. The Ghost Battalion had created a generation of disillusioned warriors, but it had also created a generation of potential witnesses. If enough of them came forward, the organization's crimes would be impossible to deny or cover up. The work was dangerous and slow, but it was also necessary. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about redeeming the innocent who had been used by the guilty. The secure conference room in Geneva was filled with the kind of tension that came from bringing together people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. 23 former Ghost Battalion pilots, representing 7 different nationalities, sat around a table that had been designed for international diplomacy, but was now being used for something that felt more like group therapy. Vera looked around the table, recognizing some faces from her time in the organization, but seeing others for the first time. Each pilot had their own story of recruitment, manipulation, and eventual disillusionment. Each had risked everything to come forward with their testimony. Dr. Mueller stood at the head of the table, her expression reflecting the weight of the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're doing here today is unprecedented. Never before have so many members of a covert military organization come forward simultaneously to expose crimes committed by their own commanders. The statement was both inspiring and terrifying. The pilots in the room represented years of institutional knowledge about the Ghost Battalion's operations, but they also represented targets that the organization couldn't afford to leave alive. Before we begin, Dr. Mueller continued, I need to remind everyone that your safety is our primary concern. The protection protocols we've established are extensive, but they're not perfect. The organization you're testifying against has resources and capabilities that extend far beyond what we initially realized. The warning was necessary but sobering. Each pilot in the room had already made the decision to prioritize truth over survival, but the reminder of the stakes was still chilling. Captain Maria Santos, a former Ghost Battalion pilot from Brazil, was the first to speak. Dr. Mueller, I need to ask about our families. The organization has threatened retaliation against anyone who cooperates with the investigation. Captain Santos, we have established protection protocols for immediate family members of all witnesses. But I won't lie to you, the Ghost Battalion's reach is extensive, and we cannot guarantee absolute safety. The admission was honest but not reassuring. The pilots in the room had all made the same calculation, that the risk of speaking out was less than the risk of remaining silent. But the threat to their families added a dimension of moral complexity that made the choice even more difficult. Major David Kim, a former Ghost Battalion pilot from South Korea, raised his hand. Dr. Mueller, what assurances can you give us that our testimony will actually lead to prosecutions? The organization has powerful friends in many governments. Major Kim, I can guarantee that your testimony will be thoroughly investigated and that every legal avenue will be pursued. But I cannot guarantee outcomes. The legal process is complex, and the defendants have access to significant resources. The answer was honest but highlighted the fundamental uncertainty of the situation. The pilots were risking everything for the possibility of justice, but there was no guarantee that their sacrifice would be meaningful. Vera decided to speak. Dr. Mueller, I think what we're all asking is whether this is worth it, whether the risk we're taking will actually make a difference. The prosecutor paused, choosing her words carefully. Lieutenant Colonel Kovalenko, I cannot promise you that every person responsible for these crimes will be held accountable, but I can promise you that your testimony will expose a system of corruption that has operated in the shadows for too long. Whether that exposure leads to justice depends on factors beyond our control. The answer was simultaneously honest and inspiring. The pilots weren't just testifying against individual criminals. They were challenging a system that had allowed those criminals to operate with impunity. Dr. Mueller, Captain Santos said, what happens to us after the trials? Do we get our lives back? Captain, that depends on many factors. Your military careers are effectively over. No government wants to employ pilots who have testified against covert operations. But we're working with several international organizations to provide employment opportunities for former military personnel with your skills. The admission was stark but expected. The pilots in the room had sacrificed their careers for their consciences, and there was no going back to their old lives. But there was also something liberating about the admission. For the first time in years, the pilots were free to speak the truth about what they had experienced. The secrecy and moral compromise that had defined their careers in the Ghost Battalion was being replaced by transparency and accountability. Dr. Mueller, Major Kim said, I want to make sure that other pilots don't go through what we went through. How do we prevent this from happening again? Major, that's exactly why your testimony is so important. The Ghost Battalion operated by exploiting the loyalty and dedication of good people. By exposing their methods, we can help prevent similar organizations from manipulating future generations of military personnel. The prevention of future crimes was as important as the prosecution of past ones. The pilots in the room represented a generation of warriors who had been betrayed by the system they had sworn to serve. But they could also represent the beginning of a new era of accountability and transparency. As the meeting continued, Vera found herself thinking about the future. The legal process would take years, but eventually, the truth would come out. The Ghost Battalion's crimes would be exposed, their leaders would be held accountable, and the system that had allowed them to operate would be reformed. But the cost had been enormous, and the work was far from over. The trial of Colonel Marcus Hendricks began on a cold morning in The Hague, with security measures that reflected the international significance of the case. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and representatives from the various governments whose policies had been affected by the Ghost Battalion's operations. Vera sat in the witness section, watching the man who had recruited her, trained her, and ultimately tried to save her life. Hendricks looked older than she remembered, his face lined with the weight of the charges against him. But his posture was still military straight, and his eyes held the same intelligence that had made him such an effective commander. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Dr. Mueller, who